All right, we're going to get started on the last activity for today. So just to give you a little bit of context before we set you off on some talking at your tables. We decided on this topic, as I said at the beginning of the day, back in the fall. And things have changed, and like the pieces of the puzzle have moved a little bit. But across our network, which is now about 270 plus organizations, includes a lot of you that work around food. And from the food banks to county, city, local organizations, and really trying to understand if there was some way for us to do a bit of a deep dive in on a topic. This is our 16th convening. We started in the summer of 2018, and we've done this twice a year since then. So we've covered a lot of ground together, and I was just mentioning to somebody, probably at each convening, we have about, a 20% overlap of people who came to the last convening to the people who come to this convening. Timing, topic, all kinds of things are a factor in that. If we were to pull everybody together who's ever been at one of our convenings, it's probably about 1,000 people across the 5 counties. And someday, somebody will plan that really huge convening. It probably won't be me, but the network has a lot of reach and kind of a lot of tendrils that go out, and you all are an incredibly important part of that. But every year in December, our board passes a budget for the following year. And for the prior 3 years, the board has approved a pot of discretionary funds where we have used a review committee made up of partners who are in the network to review proposals that come from people in the network. The first year, they had about $3.5 million. The second year, they had about $3 million. The third year, they had about $4 million. And in December, with Petra's help, and since I can't see anybody, Petra's somewhere in this room, the board approved probably up to about $6 million that we could distribute in 2026. And because we've been having this conversation about the convening, really trying to figure out, is there a way we can leverage the network to lean in on food security? It became a priority, not an exclusion, but a priority for these funds. So I don't know if Melissa's still in here or if she's out in the hallway. We've set ourselves a target date internally that the applications will be released around April 1st. No joke, no April Fool's stuff, just a date. And what we're hoping that you all will do, a little bit of reflection on what you all heard. And there'll be a slide up here that, lists some questions for you. But part of what we're also asking of you, tell us what the criteria should be as we are reviewing applications. $6 million from a nonprofit is a huge chunk of change. But I'm going to tell you, it's nothing compared to what the food banks have lost. It's nothing compared to what the counties are losing. It is nothing compared to what the state is losing. So we got to keep this all relative. And there is not a week that goes by where somebody in the network does not send me an email saying, I have an idea, can the ACH support X? And we're trying to be strategic based on your insights and input to us. So we're going to ask you to go through some questions, and these are the questions. But really, it's like the fourth question. I shouldn't say that. The other 3 questions are really, really important. It's the fourth question that's going to give me and our team some homework to do between now and April 1st. So at your tables, there is a table facilitator. It's a staff person. If our staff that are the table facilitators could just raise your hand so that everybody knows who you are. Wait a minute. I'm seeing a table where nobody raised their hand. Is it you, Jacqueline? Okay. Thank you. Okay. The first thing that we're going to have the table facilitator do is for you all to actually pick somebody who is not a staff person to report out when we're done with this exercise. So that's going to be like your first task. Please don't ask the staff person to report out on behalf of the table. One of you all decide that you're going to do that. But we want you to just talk about amongst yourselves, like how do you experience and see food insecurity with the people that you serve? Because at every table, you're going to have like a real variety of organizations and leaders. If there are like one or two things that you want to lift up from the broad and deep array of presenters that you just got to listen to, what ways do you see your organization working on this issue, either currently or in the future? Right? There's opportunity sitting in this room as well, not just what you were doing today and yesterday, but what could you do? And then advice to us as the ACH is trying to leverage the funds that we have available with a priority focus on food insecurity. What should we prioritize when we are reviewing the applications that we know are going to come from you and from others? The applications are limited to organizations that are in the Collaborative Action Network. So just know that there's 270 plus organizations. We cannot have 500 organizations applying because we don't have 500 organizations in the network. But that's still a lot of organizations. In the past, we have only accepted applications where organizations are collaborating with another partner. You're focused in on the vital conditions, and right now we're prioritizing the vital condition that is around food. Are there other things that we should have as criteria when we're reviewing whatever applications come in? Because I think the last year, and Cynthia probably knows best, we had about $4 million. We got like $11 million in applications. So whoever gets on this review committee, some tough decisions in front of them, you all can help in sharing with us what lens should we be looking at, what criteria we should be looking at. Our table facilitators, I think, are the note takers. Keiko, I'm looking at you. Are also the note takers. So they're going to be capturing what you say. If there's something you want to write down and just slip to Nika or to me or somebody, like just do that. We'd really like to walk out of this room with some ideas from you. How should we focus this application and the review process by April 1? So before I say like your clock has started, is there anybody who's going, I don't know what we're talking about at our table? All right. Awesome. That never happens. But around 3:10, 3:15, we're going to try and start doing a report out. What did you all talk about at your tables? So with that, off you all go. All right, table 6 is getting a reprieve. We're starting with table 2. And if you could introduce yourself and then tell us what you came up with.
Hi, I'm Claudia Costa. I'm with the Lopez Community Land Trust with table 2. We're kicking us off. So we went through questions 1, 2, and 4. For the first question, I think what we took most away from this was that food security and food access is a lot about beyond just access and a lot more about knowledge with how the foods we eat feel in our bodies, not knowledge about where the food we grows impacts that nutritional value, knowledge about where these resources can be found is huge, as well as just the relationships that lead to these food networks, just hearing about the suppliers for Lummi and the relationships at the Bellingham Food Bank and how that impact, I mean, just firing all the volunteers when you had the opportunity and then building, clear opportunity there. And then for question 2, name 2 things. I think the biggest standout was just how food banks and food security really used to have an emergency label on them and how they're really, in this time as everything gets more expensive, just how much more of the food system it really takes up, how it's really becoming a foundational piece and providing access in a time where other systems are really trying to diminish that opportunity. And then for question 4, we talked a lot about, because there's representation here from rural counties as well as more suburban urban counties, just how we prioritize and try to expand the frameworks that we're looking at. Just looking at the collaborative piece there, I think we were talking about how it is both important to view this through a relational lens, but also consider how setting up certain frameworks will always exclude people. So I think that was a big part of our conversation. Anything else? Do you want
I just offered a question for consideration that when we're talking about food, this basic need, is it necessary for these applications to be entirely competitive? Or is it possible to consider supporting organizations broadly, all organizations that apply with certain weighting or indexes for culturally appropriate foods or certain activities they might do? So just an exploration of the process. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for getting us started. Haley, your table's next.
Hey everybody, I'm Henry. At my table, we didn't stay so neatly in the lines of the questions, so I'll do my best to share with you. On the note of how we experience food insecurity, we talked about intersecting vulnerabilities and how we all see different vulnerabilities come up in our work, but oftentimes we see that these vulnerabilities intersect to compound folks' experiences of food insecurity. For example, we talked about how folks in rural contexts face really unique challenges with food access, and that can impact food security. And we also talked about how immigrants are facing challenges to food access right now. For someone that is both living in a rural context and an immigrant, that experience might look different and even more uniquely challenging. So we talked about how that all shows up. On the note of the funding piece, we have a couple suggestions. Some folks in our group felt like flexibility was really important. We feel that organizations are good at allocating funds, that's what they do, and that a more flexible general fund to pull from as needed might be desirable if that's feasible. Additionally, we talked about how funders often seek new and exciting projects or expanded or enhanced projects as benchmarks for funding. But in reality, a lot of the time what's needed is just program sustainment, particularly as the funding climate continues to dry up. So that's of great interest for us as well, just trying to keep doing what we're doing and get funded to do so. That's all I got. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
We're in this together. The only difference is that sometimes the communities that we serve, the underserved communities, a lot of times, we assimilate or we assume that everybody's created equal. But there's a huge difference because a lot of times the people that we serve are not the ones that are able to receive a lot of the a lot of the support from different programs. So I like the idea, like what came from the schools district, as far as if you qualify for something, then you qualify for the rest. Well, that's not so in our communities, and then we're having them drive from place to place, and a lot of times they don't qualify. So it's it's their time, but it's also our time to interview somebody for an hour to see if they qualify, and then at the end of the day, to run them off with no services at all because our funding is limited. So we're hoping that we could do a better job of supporting communities like that. And for the last question, again, I think we should look at those communities that serve the underserved communities, because there is a huge difference, because even though they're poor, they might be 10 times worse off than a lot of communities. Not that they're any more special, but they're suffering in a different way. Being afraid to go to the food bank because of ICE, or being afraid of different things, but also the way a lot of times who we reflect on, also who's helping, let's say the different organization or the food bank, does it reflect our community? So I would say look at, for the dollars and stuff, make sure that we also see the underserved communities in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Oh, good.
Hi, I'm Ruth. I work for the YWCA as a community health worker. Our table was 4 community health workers, 3 of us from the YWCA, one of them from CHPW, and then our representative from our BABES team at the YWCA who works with people who are HIV positive. We identified primarily food insecurity in our work as a matter of holistic access to food resources, not simply is there a place that will give me food, but how do I get to that place? How will I cook the food once I have it? Do I have a can opener that I can use to access it? Do I have a place to store it, et cetera? We discussed the generalized lack of accessible food access education in our communities, whether they are in rural areas or urban areas, people who speak English as a second language, and how there is a large reliance on single points of contact with community health workers and on word of mouth and direct referrals. We learned from the presenters earlier this sort of generalized narrative that everyone seems to be talking about, where we had an influx of funding when the government was actively responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then we are now within the shadow of that funding now that the government has manufactured a justification to remove that funding and ended the pandemic, although we know people are still getting sick. And that the people who are doing this work on food banks are primarily responding to this crisis by creating these hyper-local, very heavily inter-reliant networks of different organizations, that they're actually doubling down on how do we make our systems more resilient, and how do we expand our focus by eliminating means testing and food policing and other forms of administrative burden for our clients rather than taking on austerity thinking. The ways that we primarily work with this issue as community health workers, as people who work with primarily disabled or sick program participant populations, is by engaging in these broader holistic referral processes. We all do a lot of transportation referrals. We directly deliver food to people in rural areas or people who are homebound. We help people very specifically with transportation is really the biggest thing for so many of us. A service gap that we're still trying to figure out. And this sort of works into what we want people to do with this money is, we haven't really heard any hot meal site discussion for adults at this conference, which is really important to people who are unhoused, who can't cook their own food, and that in general, we would recommend that this money be used to support programs that are not sort of trapped in austerity thought, that are trying to broaden their program participant populations and make things accessible for everyone, and therefore serve these niches that we don't know about, serve these patient gaps that we don't know about, and continue to develop more interdependent community organization collaboration, because the state won't give us this money and we only have ourselves to defend this work of giving food to everyone.
All right, table 10.
Hello, I'm Anna Maria. I'm from CMAR. We had a lot of interesting discussions. I think at the end of the day, I'll just kind of highlight question number 4. I think that was where we had a lot of discussion around, the babies in the water. And the reality is that you've got the start and the end. Is there a way to break the chain in the middle? And so the discussion around funding is, if you're going to, we talked a lot about education seems to be a piece of not having enough to educate people on what services actually exist. So if there is enough food in America, how do we kind of break that chain with education? But then at the same time, looking at that piece is, okay, you're educating people, but then how do we teach them to then actively be able to get those resources? And so when looking at funding, how are we going to break that chain at the end of the day? Oh, yeah, I'll just add too, is like the piece of resource navigation. We talked a lot about, can we put someone in those resources that are already existing, as far as the funding, and finding ways to put kind of either a social worker or a navigator or someone who can help walk them through these pieces with these different systems that are already in existence.
All right, table 9.
All right, representing Table 9 with a grateful thankfulness to Natalie for guiding us through the question process. We also went all over the place with these questions and did not stick to them one by one. So instead, I will just list out 4 very brief points of the topics we touched on, and Natalie can communicate the 5 pages she wrote down afterwards. So number 1, culture and dignity stood out to us as a very important topic when handling all of the food institution conversations, to the degree that it's not just something you pay attention to be better at what you do, it is something you pay attention to not discriminate. It can keep people away from programs. It can really do harm when you are not being aware of the unique cultures that you're working with. A second point that came in here was, I think, brought up by a table over here earlier. We should be evolving rather than reinventing. So we're at a table with a lovely social worker, and they have a million great ideas. There's really good ways for them to improve their programs. Rather than having an external figure come in and try to tell them how to do that, perhaps there's funding routes that can help their individual programs improve within. Like, rely on the experts rather than getting external consultants to come in and spend all your money. Number 3, actually that was number 3. Number 4. Red team, blue team, what does it look like to pretend that the federal government is no longer available? What does it look like to pretend that we don't have access to additional food streams outside of Washington State or Pacific Northwest Greater if you're working there? What if we consider putting a lens on these funds where it is supporting that middle level infrastructure and the small-scale food production in our local communities that then becomes available for emergencies, becomes available for food banks, creates better employment, and creates direct connections between those individual food producers and their community nexus? Can we do more network theory here and try to build something that is more oriented towards our independent sovereignty? That's redundant, independent sovereignty. But, all right, that's table 9.
Hi, we're table number 8. I'm Hannah. I'm a community health worker at South County Fire. So one of the major things that kind of came up at the beginning of our conversation was how the crippling kind of impacts that can come from experiencing food insecurity, and how it creates kind of a sense of hopelessness, and how that nutritional impact impacts their care and connection with just kind of community and that kind of stuff, and how it just kind of is part of the spiraling effect. And we were talking about ways that that kind of can be addressed, and one of the things that came up in that was like the flexibility of funds coming in to meet people where they're at, and having community partners who don't have outcomes necessarily attached to what they're expecting from people, and how also the community-based ability. I think we had a really great example of one of the people at our table talking about funds had come to them during a kind of our recent shutdown, and they basically said, we actually think this could be managed better by somebody else, and through this other pathway. And so not having this kind of like, we're the person who's gonna do it, but really remaining community-based in that. And then last thing also was for kind of prioritizing funding that came up that was kind of powerful was this idea of avoiding, again, those outcomes piece and making sure that people who are having funding cut because they don't want to give confidential information away is having the ability to have that support otherwise.
Hello, my name is Ian. I work as an organizer for Community to Community, which is a food and farm worker justice organization in Whatcom-Skagit County. I'm going to be really brief, just so that way we can make sure we can hear from all of the tables. We identified earlier during the keynote that capitalism is central to why food insecurity exists globally and here in the United States. And I would add that like racism is also deeply key to why food security exists. Those two things go together. And so a proposal addressing question 4 is that funds ideally should be prioritized for efforts that undermine capitalism and racism, right? Efforts that change the relationship. Well, ideally efforts that don't have bosses, efforts where the workers are their own bosses, and so we suggest that efforts that elevate cooperative businesses, ideally led by people of color, could substantially reduce food insecurity and move food into the communities that really need them.
Hi, I am Kenesha from Pomoja Place. This is table 14. We also went around the questions, but the main focus we played was question number 4. And one thing we'd like to applaud the organization with the $6 million is to remove application barriers. If you know a little bit about history, the work is being done by BIPOC, the global majority. And when you ask us to write an essay, we just shrivel up. We're trained in society not to talk about ourselves, right? The worship of the written word. So I would suggest, or we suggested at the table, that you do some of the application where folks has an option of doing a video. So if you have 6 questions, they can answer questions 2 through 6 with a video application. They're answering the question just the same, but they're using a video. That's a huge barrier towards applications, because normally when we're doing the work, we're doing the work. And the folks that are on the ground doing the work, they don't get the money because we don't have the data and the fancy stuff to show we'll answer one question with 2 sentences, because that's what we're doing. We're just doing the thing, right? So we'd really implore you guys to do that, to think about criteria when it comes to application and removing the application barriers and the structures, and having equity around individualized SOWs, rather than saying we want you to fit into these 3 categories, is tell us what 3 categories you spend the funds on. And then we implore the organization as well to be solid in your why and know your why, and then you can align the applications with your why for the $6 million. And that will help us to have an equitable and more flexible outcome with the funds, and have flexibility in the funds, again, knowing your end goal, knowing your why and where you'd like the money to be, and align your giving in that way. And among a lot of other things we talked about, I just want to end with, Amanda Gorman said in part of her speech, the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. So with these funds that you have, don't just do it the way you just normally do it. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Irvin. I'm from CMAR in Bellingham, and this is our group. So a lot of what's already been said, I feel like a word I've been hearing a lot is flexibility. I feel like that is pretty self-explanatory. When we need to work together as a community, being flexible is a big thing, and there's a lot of restrictions that can come into play that restrict us from helping. And so then the next big theme word is collaboration that I noticed we all focused on. With funding is the first thing that can help us, but the next thing that you need to get everything flowing is collaboration. So I would say that's a big thing I'm walking away here from, is if you look and you ask for it, most of the times you're gonna find what you need.
All right, I am Tony Hester. I work for the Center for Independence as a Senior Manager of Advocacy and Community Outreach, and I am going to speak for Table 17. And since our staff doesn't know Braille, I'm going to have to remember what we talked about. So, and we had, I think we talked about our priorities for the application, and there were two that I was tasked to remember, and that was we focused on culturally relevant foods because we thought everyone should be able to have those foods that meant something to them and that were from their culture, and it's just more equitable. And then we focused on the opposite of Table 9, that we want innovative new processes and new innovative kind of things and resources and things of that nature, because we tried the old way and sometimes the old way just doesn't work, but coming up with something new, innovative may be a better way to go. So that is us.
Hello, this is Table 18. My name is Allie. I'm with Health Ministries Network. I will keep this brief. So a few things we talked about was focus populations, so SNAP loss, benefits loss, unhoused population, chronic conditions, rural and transportation barriers. We also talked about project focus areas such as smaller distribution of food, food system navigators, just yet to see impacts like just the chain reaction of everything as well, faith-based connections and resource sharing and messaging for services. We also talked about the application requirements, having minimal reporting, unrestricted funds, no identities for clients, and then storytelling for data collection as well, so qualitative and quantitative. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Guillermina, Table 19. One of the things that we really talk about is, you all mentioned almost a little bit of everything, and we were thinking, how do we just summarize this? And very straightforward, one of the things that we talk about was about centralize the funding and how could we distribute that information or to whom. Also, there's so many smallest organization, it's hard to apply or even knowing to the fact what is they need to apply to get those fundings and then receive a pushback. Also, how to retain employees, which is perhaps not employees, but also be able to give some sort of like a gift card or stipend that will not be in the long run be able to jeopardize within the taxes. And also be able to address anything as how equity may look in different lens from different backgrounds, ethnicities. Also, what is the ask that we could also tweak in one of those fundings to be able to address the need for each in different counties or even local organizations that perhaps may be able to push a pushback with that funding available for each individual that are looking for that be able to support within their organizations. So pretty much that's it. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Joseph from Whatcom Center for Early Learning. Most of our suggestions have already been made, but we have a few things. We want to, of course, simplify the application a little bit. We want to put an emphasis on the very young and the very old in our food, like 0 to 5 years old and over 60. We'd like to also look at special populations such as pregnant women and people with special dietary needs is an important concept. Pet foods, of course, because a lot of families feed their animals before they feed themselves. We've all talked about flexibility, language access for people who use other languages other than English. A lot of our poor rural families tend to rely on fast foods, unfortunately, because they're cheap and quick and easy. So, of course, education, as was spoken about earlier, have a good way to educate people on making gardens and how to fix the food that they grow. That's fine. Thank you.
I know ACH folks weren't supposed to talk, but we decided the youngest at the table was supposed to talk, so it was the gray-haired baby.
And here I thought you were just trying to show me that you didn't have to listen to me.
Right. Well, also Van told me to. So,
All right, she takes precedence, that's good.
Right, I know. So I'll go quick because we also covered quite a bit of what we heard already. I think one of the things that we learned from hearing everybody talk today is hearing about the funding streams that maybe people have or don't have, that different programs have. And also just the administrative constraints, the rules, the boundaries about who can be served, who hasn't. But just hearing some of the creativity that folks have within those programs to get as close to those boundaries as possible to keep serving people. I think if we're thinking about the asset-based thinking, I think that's a huge thing. Just hearing about the care that people have in the programs that are here. Sorry, I'm a little croaky because I've been talking all day. I think the other thing that just came up that I haven't heard so much about as we've gone around the circle, and so we've got food bank folks and then folks who are working with immigrants, refugees, and migrants here, is just the huge impact that a lack of safety is having right now on folks in those populations actually going out and accessing services. I think we all know it, but it's really, really severe. And I think one thing that we didn't quite talk about, but I think is going to be important to think about in the years to come, is that's a lot of trust that is just being shattered in a lot of the institutions we have right now. And the clock is going to tick forward eventually, because it always does, but just because we go from one administration to the next, whatever that looks like, the trust doesn't magically come back. So I think just bearing that in mind as we move forward and how we address that as well, I think is going to be really important. So.
Hi everyone, my name is Remy. We talked about sustainability and self-reliance, really talking about making sure food access and basic needs are in the budget from the very beginning, knowing that budgeting is belonging and not an afterthought, and really realizing that self-reliance and sustainability is not going to come from the government. It's not going to come with tools that the oppressor uses. It's not going to come from a system that has created the problems that we're trying to solve. So really getting creative with what you can build, not relying on the government.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm an AmeriCorps employee with CMAR. And I feel like what was shared is kind of a lot of what we talked about already, but I think the highlight of what we chatted at our table was the fact that there are so many resources already available. And so how do we use all of those resources that we already have and kind of expand on them rather than trying to reinvent the wheel or make it better. And a couple points that we wanted to highlight related to our criteria was how are we measuring outcomes, like what is the measure of success and healthy outcomes, and then also supporting trusted community-based systems and trusted community partners, and then as well as meeting transportation needs, language access, and culturally relevant healthy foods. And then lastly, too, just highlighting on the importance of innovation, and then as well as making sure that there is room for overhead fees or administrative fees in that proposal as well.
Hi, my name is Alexis from Little Mountain Pediatrics. I'll make this very quick because I'm actually might faint. We answered 2 and 3. One thing that we can all walk away with, the point of view that we got from the presenters. They're the boots on the ground. Me as a CHW, I'm referring to them, but I'm not seeing their point of view. I'm not seeing that they're busting at the seams. So I think that was really inspiring to see. And then number 2 is, I was a kid that grew up on the Tri-Parish Food Bank. And so how are we utilizing the resources that we know in our county, and how are we tailoring it to our clients or patients? How are we helping them best navigate these resources, like all different food banks, they have different styles. If you know that the Tri-Parish one is a drive-up versus Cedar Woolley is a grocery style, how can we tailor the experience of the resources that we're recommending to our patients in a way that accommodates and helps them? How are we getting that out of them instead of just handing them a piece of paper that said, hey, they're open at this time? We're kind of, especially me in my job, some of them are young parents, some of them have to deal with stigma of, like, they've never been, they might prefer the Tri-Parish, or they might be a vet and they're not scared or have any stigma to go to the Cedar Woolley one. So that's kind of what we talked about. And then for the fourth question, we talked about how we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to pour into those resources that are doing the work, are producing the fruit that we all bear, and how can we put them in a position to do so. Okay, I'm done.
Hello, my name is Liam Todd, and I'm representing table number 20 right now. Let's see, as for accessibility, we talked about, or for reasons for food insecurity, we talked about affordability was the predominant reason why people are food insecure in the areas which we observe and live, but also access and attitude/education, where we have people at our table who work directly with food desert areas and notice that especially in those areas, even if we're selling good healthy food that's grown locally, people aren't necessarily able to afford it without government funds like SNAP or EBT or WIC or whatever. And then I'm gonna delineate from the questions for the most part after that. Let's see, we talked a lot about local food system resilience and moving away from industrial agriculture and the export trade that stuff like berries and dairy are really widely seen in northern, in the counties up north, Whatcom and Skagit, and moving more toward growing food for our own people and not for, buyers out of state or literally around the world that want our berries. And we also talked about prioritizing collaboration between groups. Like I remember somebody said, there's people all the way on the other side of the room that are doing very similar work to the people at our table, but it's difficult, as we probably already know, to actually effectively collaborate between that and create networks that are not only lasting but functional. And I think the last thing that I'll really highlight is we talked about prioritizing, what was the word here, underserved communities and BIPOC communities as leaders in food production, because, from what we talked about, largely food growers are generational, white families that don't treat their workers well, and that's something we didn't quite talk about was labor rights within food production, but that seriously needs a lot of change. Okay, I'm gonna leave it right there. Thanks.